So most of you probably know this by now, but the iPod, including the iPod Touch 7th generation, is completely pretty much done. It's been done for a little bit of time now, but here's the craziest thing. The iPod at one point was basically Apple's bread and butter. You could not think of a day where Apple wouldn't continue making the iPods, but markets change, a ton of things change throughout the board, and I would say the iPod in general is kind of a cool case study to kind of look like, where if you look back 10, 20 years, you could not think of an Apple without an iPod, but now you don't really even think of the iPod anymore, you think of the iPhone. So 10, 20 years from now, will we still be thinking about Apple as the iPhone company, or will there be something like even crazier that Apple has made, where we look at the iPods and kind of be like, oh, or we look at the iPhone and we're like, oh, it's like it was popular back in the day, but nobody really cares. They're not known for that anymore. That's how I kind of see the iPod Touch 7th generation as kind of being that last kind of like, okay, like let's just go and end off on a high note and kind of see where we go on from here. And it's kind of interesting. Every time I talk about the iPod Touch 7th generation, it always brings back that mindset of how a company can kind of reinvent themselves and kind of change their perception, how they're kind of perceived from a lot of different, basically by their customers is kind of how I'm trying to get at. So the iPod Touch 7, I probably wouldn't recommend people to buy it anymore, but I still like the thought process behind iPod, and considering this was basically the last iPod ever made, it's always so interesting to kind of take a look at it. The design never really changed from the iPod Touch 5th generation, I think. Ever since the iPod Touch 5, which came out many years before this thing, they never really changed the design, which I think was kind of a smart thing for Apple to do. What were they going to make, like a completely bezel-less type of iPod? It was just never going to happen. This thing came out in 2019, which by that point I would say iPod was dead, but now iPod is completely dead considering these devices are no longer getting software support either. So once Apple dropped support of this thing, I thought, there's no way iPods are coming back, and I think that's totally fine. On the front side though, you were getting this 4-inch panel. For quite a bit of time, this was the smallest panel Apple was making, which I thought was fine. Even the iPhone 13 mini had a bigger display, way bigger display than this thing. Now the display itself really wasn't that bad. You were getting the top bezel, the bottom bezel, the home button right there too. So like I said before, you've definitely seen worse panels than this thing, but I still think this thing looked pretty good for how old this thing was. And I think once again, that's kind of an interesting thing going on for these particular iPods. On the bottom, you were getting your lightning port, which I think was very important to have. I'm glad this thing ended off with a lightning port, which most of the iPods, even the iPod Touch 5 had the lightning port too, so it would be more surprising if they moved away from it. Imagine if this iPod brought USB Type-C. You're getting the headphone jack on this iPod as well. The sides I've always liked about these iPods because they were like kind of flat, but they kind of curved on the side too. And I really did like the design of this iPad from that standpoint as well. On the back side, you were getting your back camera, which again was so random to have inside of these iPods, but I'm glad Apple threw them in here. I think it was like a good touch. And you were getting your flat back, Apple logo in the center, and that was kind of it. It was a pretty, average type of feeling device, but again, this was an MP3 player. This thing was, just basically there for listening to songs. You may want to play some games here and there on this type of iPod too, but I think for a generation or two when Apple made the iPod Touch 7, I think the main reason people were even buying this thing or Apple was even selling it was mostly for like developers. Maybe for like, people who wanted to buy their kids an iPod instead of an iPhone. But considering iPhones at this time were so cheap in the used market, you would rather just go ahead and buy like a used iPhone with like a bad IMEI number and then just go and give that to your kid, rather than going through and spending more money for an even worse product like the iPod Touch 7. But I think for developers, it was nice to be able to just go inside of the Apple Store, buy a brand new Apple product, and then just walk out of the store and develop things. This was the cheapest way to get into the Apple ecosystem. And probably for some developers, it was nice for them to go and test out applications on a pretty decent performing device in 2019 and be able to just kind of test it out and kind of go on from there. So I think that in and of itself was another reason why Apple probably really made this thing too. On top of that, this chipset was only like 3 years old at the time as well, so it really wasn't like the oldest thing of the time either. Camera-wise, kind of an interesting type of styling to have of a camera on this thing. The front camera really wasn't that great, but you were getting an 8 megapixel camera on the back, which really wasn't that bad. You could film in like 1080p videos all the way up to 60 frames per second. Again, not that great of a camera anymore, and it is a fairly outdated type of sensor, if you can kind of imagine it. That's just, again, kind of what's happening when you're getting these types of cameras. But again, it's totally understandable. When you're getting a phone like this, you would kind of expect it to not be the best performing thing of all time, and there's definitely going to be problems and issues that you're going to run into. But I do think for a lot of different people out there too, it was a pretty decent performing device when it first came out from a camera perspective, just because it was so small, just because you could kind of just throw things around here, and considering applications like Snapchat and Instagram and all those apps are still available for this iPod Touch 7th generation, you could still go ahead and just utilize those particular iPod, you could utilize this particular device for those particular apps. And for a student or something like that, if you just were given this, from your parent or something, it was still a really nice thing to have and be able to, kind of utilize those things inside of this device when it comes down to it. So I would say from that particular perspective as well, it kind of gets a thumbs up for me just because it was, just because it had a camera. You don't even need a camera in this thing, but just because it had one, that was another cool thing going on for this particular iPod at that time. From a software perspective though, this is probably one of the more lackluster things going on for this particular iPod. And that is kind of not the issue, but that is kind of maybe a slight thing when you're getting these older iPads and iPods, the problem that you're running into. And that is basically the lack of software support. Like this thing is not going to be getting the next generation of software. And for an iPod Touch, you probably don't need it. And even for this thing ending off at iOS 15 really is not the biggest deal in the world. Like I still think that's totally fine. But if you're somebody who wanted to go and utilize this thing and you wanted to still expect software support or features or anything like that going on in the future, that's not really what's going to end up happening here. You are definitely going to be getting more of a older style type of, device going on here. And once again, that might be a problem for you if you're expecting everything from this device. Again, I think you're totally fine if you're just going to use this thing as like an iPod as what it's meant for right now. But for the average person, this thing is not going to be giving you any more features, any cool things going on in the future, and it's only getting worse from here. So I'm going to say that with every single Apple product that is done getting software support, or any Android or anything that's done getting software support, you're always going to run into more issues because it's just an older device getting older with no future ahead of it. So keep that in mind. But for an MP3 player, that may not even be important. And from a performance side, it was giving you that Apple A10 Fusion chip inside of it with like 2 gigabytes of RAM, which I think is still actually pretty decent. If this phone was still getting, or this iPod was still getting, the current versions of iOS, you might be okay with this type of performance. But like I said, this is kind of the problem that you're getting with these older devices, is that the software's done getting support, and then like the chipset is already old too. So you're kind of stuck in this multi-situation where it's not really worth buying in really in any capacity. And that is kind of the problem that you're getting here. And when I'm getting this type of device, I would expect it to be a little bit better in some ways. And again, that's kind of what's happening with this type of device. So from a performance side as well, like if you're trying to go through and just use this thing as like a pretty basic iPod, like you're just trying to play games with it or you're trying to do things like that, you might be okay for the most part. Like you may not run into like a crazy amount of issues. But like I said, if you're trying to go through and try to, play a bunch of heavy intensive games, or you're trying to do something crazy on this particular device, it may not be that great of an experience. And that might be a reason why you're going to run into some problems with this particular device when it comes down to it. So I will tell you, when it comes down to this particular device in 2024, I really don't think, the iPod Touch 7th generation is worth buying anymore, really in any capacity. I think you are much better off purchasing devices that are still worth buying. And like I said, I don't think this is one I would recommend anyone to buy anymore. I think a device like the iPod, Touch 7th generation ended off on like a high note. I think, in some ways it's still kind of relevant, but in most ways it's only relevant because it was like an iPod. I don't think this iPod is worth buying anymore. It's not really worth buying it anymore. I wouldn't really recommend it. You're much better off buying devices that are still supported with software. So buy like an iPhone 10 or newer. Don't really buy this thing anymore. So that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.